Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Anbernic has made a new controller. It's called the G01. Let's take a look at it here today. It's a pretty standard looking PC controller other than this 2.5-inch display right here on the front. Now, this is only for adjusting the settings. You can't put any cat videos or anything else on this controller. But now that I have that disappointing news out of the way, I have some good news too. It's a pretty good controller, all things considered, especially at the price point that they're asking, which is around $40 before shipping. So in this video, we're going to take a look at all the things that it can do and some of the things that it cannot do and whether or not that's going to be a good fit for you. Grab your favorite snack and drink. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, right out of the gate, let's talk about the price. It's $40 retail, but for the first few days, they're going to have a whopping $4 off coupon. So if you do pick it up right when making this video, then you'll save a few dollars. It comes in 3 different colors, yellow, black, and white, and I've got 2 of them here to review. Now, word of warning, if you do buy one of these controllers, is that with the last controller, they embedded the shipping cost into every single controller as a way, I am assuming, of keeping the price lower, at least at first, before you check out. So it was like a $20 or $25 controller, and then they would charge you $15 shipping per controller. And I'm expecting something similar with this as well. So even though it is $40, I'm expecting around $15 shipping. So it's really about a $55 controller when you think about it. I'm going to dive into this in more detail later, but let's quickly go over each of the specs so you understand what we're getting here. So this thing will work on PC, including Linux and Windows, as well as mobile, so it can work on iOS and Android, and then it also works with Switch 1 and 2. The D-pad is very clicky. They call it a tactile switch. It feels very much so like an Xbox Series controller. And like with a lot of other PC controllers, it's got micro switch buttons, and so they are very clicky too. The joystick technology is inductive. This is similar to a Hall effect stick, but it also reduces electromagnetic interference. I'll leave a good explanation link down below if you want to read a little bit more about it, but I think this is going to be pretty good for a PC controller. The triggers are magnetic Hall effect, and they also have trigger stops if you want to have a digital input. And then also that screen that we talked about before is 2.5 inches and slightly curved and is an IPS LCD. As far as connectivity, you can use it with a 2.4 gigahertz dongle or also Bluetooth 5.0, or you can just connect it with a cable and use it wired. The battery is also quite large. It's 2100 milliamp hours, or about 20 hours of actual gameplay between charges. Of note, this only charges at 5 watts, so it takes a couple hours to fully charge. And as far as weight, it's 289 grams, a little bit over 10 ounces. This is almost identical to the weight of an Xbox Series controller with AA batteries inside. Okay, let's take a look inside of the box, and of note, Anbernic sent me over 2 controllers for review, and so like with all my videos, they're not going to see this ahead of time, no money was exchanged in any way, and all opinions are my own. The box is very simple, very Anbernic, so it's got the 3 colors, and that's about it. Inside the box, we've got the controller itself, a 2-meter or 6-foot cable, and then a couple other goodies down below. They've got one of those cheap cell phone clamps, so if you wanted to connect this to the top of the controller, you could do that as well. I think there are better ways to play mobile games, but you could do that with the same controller here. It also comes with taller joystick caps if you'd like to have more precise gaming, and then also their 2.4 gigahertz dongle, and this one's much smaller than on their previous controller. I also like that it's labeled Anbernic, so in case I misplace this, I know that it connects to the controller. And then finally, we've got one small user manual that will talk you through the settings, which we'll go through in this video. Okay, I've got the yellow and the white ones. I've been mostly testing with the white one this whole time, but I kind of like the color of the yellow one. The black and yellow contrast in particular is just really striking for me. I tend to like this color in general, and it's unique for a controller. So this is the one that we're going to focus on in this video. And first impressions of the controller is that it feels quite comfortable. It's nice and rounded. It's a good size. It reminds me of an Xbox controller, but maybe a little bit taller, probably because of this 2.5-inch screen. The front has a glossy texture to it. You can also remove this faceplate, which we'll do later, and then it's got a texture on the back here and then just a typical plastic on the side. But in terms of just overall heft and feel, I think it's very nice. I have medium-sized hands and everything is very easy to access, but I think if you've got smaller hands, the taller height of this might make it a little bit harder to hit the shoulders and triggers. At the same time, if you've got big old hands, then this might be a little bit more comfortable than a typical Xbox controller. The other thing I noticed right out of the gate is that we've got these little locks right here for the triggers, and by default they're going to be up, which is going to be a Nintendo Switch input. So it's just a digital 0 to 100% input here. They call this a 3-degree input. And in this position, I think it's very comfortable. My fingers don't touch it in any way, and it feels good. So if I'm playing Switch games, it's a nice fit. However, when you flick it down, you can see that the post actually gets a lot taller than it was previously. So it's nice and thin here and in a good position, and then it gets quite big. This does give you that full analog input, which feels great, especially with more modern titles. But the unfortunate thing is this post right here kind of gets in the way of my middle finger. And so this is the first ergonomic thing that I noticed right off the gate, is that my middle fingers press up against these little posts when I have it in the analog input mode, which is most of the time. If we look at some other controllers, they've got them positioned in a better place. This is the GameSir Supernova right here, and you can see that, yeah, this is a perfect position. My fingers are never going to touch this spot, but they are accessible if I need them. Same thing with the 8BitDo Ultimate 2. You can see that these are right here, super easy to access, and also don't take up any space. Here's another PC controller I really love, the GameSir G7 Pro, and this one has the same thing where they're in an excellent position. And then finally, my favorite might be on the Cyclone 2 from GameSir as well. These are actually embedded within the trigger, and so you actually flick them from within here and then use it like that. And so this is probably the perfect position for me because I'm never going to touch them. So this is something I noticed right off the bat, in that it does get in the way of my middle finger. It's probably one of the worst positions I've seen with a PC controller that has trigger stops. The other thing I noticed is that this is almost identical to another controller that I've seen before, the Manba One. I actually picked this one up so I could compare it against the Anbernic. And yes, sure enough, these things are almost identical between the two. You can see they have the same sort of design to them. There are a couple things that are a little bit different, like the caps on the analog sticks are a little bit different, and the D-pad is membrane on this one while it's clicky on the other. But overall, I would say that these are probably made in the exact same factory. My guess is there's probably a white label factory that will make these controllers on demand for certain companies and then allow you to put your own branding on them. And so my guess here is that Manba did that and Anbernic did as well. Even the little details like the texture on the back and the location of the trigger stops and just the design of the shoulders and triggers is so similar between the two. There are also some subtle differences. For example, this one has a little bit different of a layout on the screen, but it does the exact same thing. This one also has RGB lighting along the sides, which you can adjust in the settings. And then finally, this one also comes with its own charging dock. And the charging dock is solid. It will fit with the controller very nicely, and you can also put the 2.4 gigahertz dongle underneath, and so then you can just have a single cable solution like you can with 8BitDo and GameSir products too. So overall, I love the fact that there is a charging dock for this one. The first Anbernic controller, the P01, also looked and felt like a knockoff of the 8BitDo Ultimate controller as well. So I'm not surprised that the new controller also looks like other controllers on the market. Now, the Manba One is more expensive than the Anbernic. This one is $70 retail on Amazon, but with free shipping, and you can probably find it cheaper on AliExpress if you wait for a deal, whereas this one is $40 plus $15 shipping. So there's about a $15 price difference between the two at the retail level, and it probably has to do with this charging dock. Now, personally, I love these charging docks because the peace of mind that comes from just dropping your controller into the dock and then picking it up and knowing that it's fully charged. But unfortunately, that's not going to be an option with the Anbernic because it doesn't have the pogo pins that are required to use it with the dock. And so unfortunately, even if they sold it as a later accessory, it would probably be a janky setup compared to something that's seamless like this. And I gotta say, it hurts a little bit that they didn't go with the charging dock on the Anbernic. If they obviously went to the same factory to order their controller, this should have been one of the things that they picked up at the same time, instead of some of the other features they have on this, including a heart rate monitor, which we'll talk about later. Next, we'll talk about the controls. We'll start with the analog sticks. So these are actually pretty nice sticks. They feel nice and smooth just physically, but then also the input is very good. They've got a nice smooth circular input, and you've got very little dead zone as well. So you can configure this however you would like. There are a couple options we can do in the settings too. It's also got a lot of the features I would like to see in a modern joystick, like the metal around the post, and they have POM rings, which are a lot smoother. I've seen these on other controllers, including the Xbox LAX. If you want to swap it out for the taller joystick, it's a very simple process. You just pull it out and then plop the other one in. And so a very simple way to give you additional height here. Personally, I don't usually use these, but if you like that, for example, with a first-person shooter game, you can use that on either stick. And then finally, I also like the caps that we have here, they're very Xbox style, and they have that nice bumpy texture to them that's very grippy. And so overall, yes, I think they are very good sticks in a nice position and everything. Let's talk about the D-pad next. So it has a tactile switch, which is a little loud, but not as loud as an Xbox Series controller, but it does feel very similar to that. But the shield itself is a little bit more prominent on the north, south, east, and west. And so overall, I like the feel of this controller. It's a very precise D-pad because it pivots and you can feel every little movement. And so this is going to be great for things like Street Fighter style games and for precision platformers. I've been using it for about a week and no issues whatsoever. The face buttons are glossy and they are micro switches. They are nice and clicky, very tactile and precise. The actuation force is a little bit tough on these. Like you have to push it down a little bit hard. And I had some concerns about that, whether or not it would be fatiguing, but I don't know. I knocked out about 4 hours of Hades 2 with this and I had no problems whatsoever once I acclimated to the actuation force. There are definitely lighter buttons out there, but I don't think it's a problem. The face buttons took me a minute to actually get used to, but the start buttons on the right, the select buttons on the far left, this is the capture button. I never really used it. And then this is the home button. So if you tap on that, it'll bring up the Xbox menu if you're playing in Windows, or if you press and hold it, it'll bring up the settings menu on the screen, which we'll check out later. Other than that, we've got 2 rumble motors that are just standard, like they're not special haptic or anything. And then this faceplate also comes off. So you have to take off the D-pad first, which comes out like that. And then you can take off the rest of the faceplate. It's held in magnetically. Once you have it out, you could then use a screwdriver to get further inside if you needed to, for example, replace your joysticks or maybe just clean it out. And then one thing worth noting is the face buttons are not interchangeable on this. So you're going to be stuck with the Xbox A, B, X, Y pattern. If these pulled out and they don't, it's just a little bit too curved on one side to be able to swap A, B, X, Y anyway. On the top, we've got our USB-C port for charging as well as using it in wired mode. And then we've also got that adapter right here to be able to connect it to a cell phone. Now, this does not adjust angles in any way. It just opens up to be able to put your phone inside. So very rudimentary. And personally, I've never found this to be a very comfortable experience anyway. The angle that it holds your phone at is not half bad, but I would much rather have the ability to adjust it as needed depending on my gameplay style. I do like the shoulder and triggers on this device. The shoulders are a little bit clicky, but not super loud. And then I do like the analog input here. They're very much so shaped like an Xbox controller, but a little bit rounded on the top. And they do have a nice texture to the plastic as well that feels good on my finger. And so overall, I like the feel of these triggers and shoulders altogether. On the back, we've got the trigger stops that we talked about earlier. I think it is a shame that the mode that I like the best, the analog mode, is the one that's the most disruptive to your actual gameplay because it gets right in the way of your middle finger. Also on the back, we've got 4 buttons that can be programmed in the software on the screen, and then we've got an on and off switch. And it's kind of funny, but I really like this switch. I like the ability to just turn on or off the controller very easily, as opposed to holding a certain button and remembering what button does what. As a whole, I think it's a very good controller. It's just very baffling to me that they have these trigger stops right in the way of your finger. How did this not get past the factory in the first place, and why did they not put them up somewhere higher? All right, now let's talk about the screen and all the features that we have inside. So first thing, you need to turn on the controller itself. It'll give you a little Anbernic logo. And then after that, it's going to immediately start pairing. And by default, it's going to try to pair with that 2.4 gigahertz dongle. So you can just plug this into your PC. It'll connect automatically, and that's it. Before we do any of that stuff, let's actually go into the menu and talk about it. So first thing you have to do is press and hold the home button for a few seconds, and this is what it's going to look like. So the first option is your different modes. So you can go into X input or D input or Nintendo Switch or Android or iOS. And you can also specify whether or not you want it to be with the receiver or with the Bluetooth connection. So for example, if you wanted to do D input, but with a 2.4 gigahertz dongle, you would set it up like that. It will restart the controller and then it'll try to connect that way. Now, if we press home again and get back into the settings, you'll see that by default it's at D input and receiver. And honestly, this is a pretty handy feature. Probably the thing I've used the most in all of my testing, just being able to swap between different platforms. With most other controllers, you have to memorize certain hotkeys, like pressing home and then Y to use, Nintendo Switch or whatever. And so I like the fact that I can just do this directly on the screen. After that, we've got the pairing menu. This will just go back into pairing mode. And then we have our settings option. There's a lot of things within here. In the button settings, we can go, and for the regular buttons, we can actually set up things like turbo speed. But then also, if we want to go into the macro buttons, the ones on the back, we can set that up as well. So if you want this to be just a single press or multiple multiple presses, you can program that all within here. In the trigger section, we have just standard stuff, so we can adjust the dead zone and how long it takes to actually get to 100% if you want something that's a little bit closer to a hair trigger. In the joystick menu, you can set up different things too. You can adjust the dead zone. You can see it's at 5% by default. We can also change out the different profiles in terms of the input. So we have one called immediate, then a latency one, which is going to be a little bit smoother feeling. And then we have the performance one too. I've just been playing it at the default straight line, but obviously if you are really getting into things and you want to adjust it to your liking, you've got 4 different options here. The sensor function is their gyroscope. So if you go into here, you can adjust it manually. So by default, it's going to be turned off, but you can map it to your left or right joystick. So for example, if you wanted the right joystick, the one you look with in a first-person shooter game, you can map that to the gyro. So you would set that. And the next section is called open method, but it's really just how are you going to turn on that. You can either have it always on, or you can actuate it with a specific button press. And then you can also adjust the sensitivity of the gyro. And then finally, you can change it between what they call racing and shot mode. I'm not really sure what the difference is between the two. I wasn't able to figure that out. And of note, this joystick function is separate than the Nintendo Switch 6-axis gyro, which works in the Switch mode, which we'll test out here later. Finally, we have the ability to adjust the vibration strength. By default, it's going to be on full speed. And I gotta say that even at its lowest speed, which is right here, it's still pretty darn strong, to the point where I mostly have just been turning it off, which is kind of a shame. I wish that we had a little bit more subtle rumble here, just because, man, it is pretty strong. To give you an idea, a game that uses a lot of rumble is Donkey Kong Bonanza, and this is so much rumble here. Even when going into the game settings and turning it down there too, it's still too much for my hands. I don't like this feeling. It feels really great on the Switch 2 itself, but this is just too strong. And so, unfortunately, yeah, I've been turning off the vibration on this controller. Further down, we've got our calibration settings, so this will adjust it for your joystick or your triggers, as well as your overall gyroscope. So you can adjust those here within the settings. The second row has the brightness adjustment, and you can adjust this on the fly, but it's only going to work for the brightness of the LCD during the settings menu. So it's only going to be right here as you're navigating through. When you actually go back to the game itself, it'll dim itself automatically, and it gets pretty dim. I actually think it's a pretty good level altogether. I've been able to play this in the dark, and it hasn't been too distracting. Unfortunately, this screen never turns off, so it's not something that times out or anything else. In fact, it won't show you the settings screen. It's just going to show you a connection screen. So you can look down and basically see that your controller is paired, which you probably already know because you're using it. And I think it's just a wasted opportunity right here. They could do so many cool things on the screen, but instead it just lets you know that you're paired the entire time and it doesn't turn off. Next to that, we've got our language settings, just Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, then Spanish and English. Next, there is a testing section. So this just goes in and lets you know whether or not your inputs are working, and that's about it. And then finally, we've got our health section. So this is for the actual heart rate monitor. When you put your hand close to the sensor, you'll see it light up like that. And then it's supposed to read your heart rate as you're playing. And I have not been able to get this to work. I don't know if it needs a firmware update or what. On both of the controllers, no matter how I hold it, how I'm playing, nothing shows up here under BPM. The idea is that if your heart rate goes over 155 BPM, it's going to show an alarm here. It's going to show something on the LCD. I'm not sure what it is because I can't get it to work. And then it's also going to vibrate at the highest setting to let you know that something's going on. I think this is probably one of the most useless features I've seen in a piece of tech. Just because you can put heart rate monitors on a controller doesn't really mean that it has utility. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I don't need a controller telling me when I'm excited. I will know when I'm excited because I will feel excited while I'm playing a game. And it's kind of a shame too because it just doesn't work in the first place. And there are other features that we've seen from the same manufacturer, like the fact that it had a wireless dock that I would love to use. And so unfortunately, I think that Anbernic picked the wrong feature for this particular controller. And who knows, maybe this is an important feature for some folks, but I'm just not really seeing the utility in it, especially when there are other things we could have with this controller, like this charging dock, or just RGB lighting across the sides of it. Okay, now let's start testing, but before that, let's talk a bit about connectivity. On their website, they say that it has a 1000 Hertz polling rate for both wired and 2.4 gigahertz wireless, and then also Bluetooth is 180 Hertz. I did some testing in software and found those exact same results when it came to X input with the wireless dongle as well as wired. I did the same thing in Nintendo Switch mode with the dongle as well as wired, but this one only got me 125 Hertz, so the 1000 Hertz seems to be limited only to X input. Same thing with the D input mode, this only connected at 200 Hertz instead of 1000, so if you want to get the highest polling rate possible, you've got to use it wired or wireless with the dongle and in X input mode. It's also worth noting they say the Bluetooth gets 180 Hertz polling rate, but that's not what I found in my testing. I only got 131 Hertz in X input mode. The other ones were about 125. And so if you are going to be playing this controller in a bit more of a competitive environment, then I would recommend X input using the 2.4 gigahertz or the wired mode. That's going to give you 1000 Hertz polling rate. Okay, let's talk about the X input mode first. Very simple to set up. All you have to do is just, go into the settings, make sure that it's set up under mode to X input and receiver. And then you can see here with my ROG Flow Z13 tablet, I've already got it set up here with the dongle, and so I just connected it, and no problem here whatsoever. The thing works really nicely. It picks it up as a generic Xbox controller. And so here we are in a game. I'm just playing Halo 1 right here in the Master Chief Collection, and everything feels very good. I've been using this controller for several days of testing, and I'm really impressed with it. One of the things that impressed me the most about it is the price of it. It's only $40 retail, and then probably $15 shipping, so we're looking at $50, $55 altogether. And that's a pretty good price point for this level of controller. Everything feels good. There's no deal breakers to the overall experience. I've got some nitpicks about like the trigger stops right here, but in general, it's been a very good PC gaming experience. While we're in here, let's talk a bit about gyro. So this is using X input, so it's not going to have gyro support to it, but you could do other things like setting it up in D input or switch mode, and then use like spoofing apps to make it think that it's a DualShock controller, so you could do that, and then use Steam input to basically make it think that it has gyro support. But you could also just do it on the controller, although I've not found that to be a very good experience. Let me show you how that works. So I'm going to press and hold the home button, which annoyingly also brings up like the Steam menu at the same time, but from there I can go over here into the settings, and then I'm going to go into the sensor section here. I'm going to map it to the right joystick, so I'm going to turn that on. Then I'm going to go back up and go over to the right. I'm going to set it to always on, and that should be about it. I just have to go back from there, and it should now have the right joystick mapped to the gyro. So here we are back in the game, and I can tilt it up and down, and I can go left and right. So all that works, but it feels very macro, like these are movements that are very big compared to the fine-grained movement that you usually would want to use when using gyro. What most people do when playing a first-person game is they aim with the joysticks, and then they fine-tune it with the gyro just a little bit. But as you can see, if I move the controller a little bit, it barely moves, so it doesn't really feel very sensitive. Compared to something like the Steam Deck, I would much rather play on that than this controller. So personally, I just have not been using gyro and just using the sticks as they are, and it's been a fine experience overall. So overall, when it comes to PC gaming, I found it to be a pretty good experience just using it as a regular old controller. I like the feel of these sticks, I like micro switches when playing PC games, so in general, this has been a great fit. The controller also works just fine in Linux, so here's my Lenovo Legion Go S running SteamOS, and yeah, absolutely no problem here. I'm using X input mode. You can also use Nintendo Switch Pro mode as well as the D input mode, and all of them worked fine for me too. Now let's talk about Nintendo Switch. This works really well. I've tried it on the Switch 1 and the Switch 2, both in docked and regular mode, and everything works pretty well. So I'm going to do Switch right here and then do receiver, and that's it. It'll have to restart itself. It's going to connect, and no problem. I had to go into the pairing just one time with the Nintendo Switch, but that's about it. And like I mentioned before, the 6-axis gyro in Switch mode is just going to work. You don't have to go into the settings and do all that stuff that we did on PC. So all you have to do is just pick a game that actually supports it, and it should work absolutely fine. And so, yeah, the 6-axis gyro is a lot better on this than trying to map it to a thumbstick like we were doing in the settings. This does have enough fine-grained movement that I feel like I could actually use this in a game as opposed to on PC. It is worth noting that this controller does not wake the Nintendo Switch or Switch 2 up from sleep, so you're going to have to turn that on manually before you pair it. You're not going to be able to just grab your controller and then turn on your console. Okay, so that's it for testing. Let's go ahead and start wrapping up, talk about what I like and what I don't like about the ROG G01 controller from Anbernic. Number one, it's a solid controller. It's a little bit taller than I was expecting, but I got used to that very easily. Now, if you have smaller hands, it might be a little bit too tall, but if you've got bigger hands, it might be more comfortable than a standard Xbox controller. I also think it's got good controls. I like the feel of these sticks. I also think the micro switches on the face buttons are great. The shoulders and triggers are good too. If you're looking for high connectivity, it does have 1000 Hertz polling, but only in X input mode when playing it with the dongle or in wired mode. But if you are looking for that, a little bit more elite level connection, it does have it. Everything else is going to give you somewhere between 125 and 200 Hertz depending on the system that you're playing on. One thing I love about it is that it's easy to configure. That screen comes in very handy when you're just trying to adjust something like which connection method you're using or just making an adjustment to the vibration strength. All of that's very easy to do compared to other controllers that require you to memorize a hotkey. I also think that it's a fair price even if they tack on $15 shipping. $55 max for this controller is not half bad considering that it's decent in terms of all the components and the overall feel. I also really dig this yellow color. I tend to prefer this color in the first place, but it's kind of cool that it's on an actual controller. Of course, there are quite a few things that I think miss the mark with this controller and are worth knowing if you do plan on picking this up. Number one is that it feels like it has some missing features. Number one is the fact that other controllers that are very similar, that probably come from the same factory, have a wireless charging dock, which is an awesome feature and one of the standards I expect in a controller for PC around the $50 price point, and unfortunately this one doesn't have that. Instead, they decided that giving us a heart rate monitor was something that we wanted, and unfortunately this is not something that I want at all. I also think the rumble motor on this controller is too strong. I usually play at the lowest level, and this low level here is much stronger than on other controllers, and so unfortunately I've just been turning it off. I mentioned it a couple times already, but I don't like the location of the trigger stops either. They're right in the way if you're going to use this in analog mode, which is what I've been using for the most part when playing it with PC games. So it's been something that's bothered me over my testing period. And even though I do like the screen in the fact that I can go in and adjust the settings, it's kind of a boring mechanic in the first place. You know, when you're actually playing a game, it doesn't really do anything at all. And I would love the ability to maybe like upload a JPEG or a GIF and then have just something fun and personalized on the screen as I'm playing. A Retro Game Core logo would be awesome. So even though the screen is a pretty neat feature, it is also a bit of a missed opportunity. And then finally, there's nothing about this controller other than the fact that it says Anbernic on the back of it that feels Anbernic. The buttons, the D-pad, the analog sticks, all of them feel like a generic PC controller input. These are not Anbernic style controls in any sort of way. Instead, it feels like Anbernic thought that their name was so trusted within the gaming community that everyone would buy a controller with their name on it, because other than the name, there's nothing special about it. I personally have a ton of PC-focused controllers, and sometimes I review them, sometimes I don't, but many of them don't really stand out that much from the others, and I feel like with this controller, I've been tricked into reviewing it because of the Anbernic name. I generally make it a point to review all of their stuff, and this one doesn't really stand out from the pack. So the way I see it, for you as a consumer, I don't want you to be tricked into thinking that this controller is special just because it also bears the Anbernic name, because it's just a nice controller that happens to have the word Anbernic on it. At the end of the day, if you're wondering whether or not I recommend it, it's a pretty good controller for the price point. I can't really think of many controllers at around $50 that are going to give you this many features. I do really like that screen and being able to adjust the settings without having to memorize hotkeys. There are a couple physical things that I wish were better, like the rumble motor as well as the trigger stops, but overall, I think it's a pretty darn good controller for the price. At the same time, around the $55 price point, there are other controllers that I prefer, including the GameSir Cyclone 2, which has the same kind of micro switchy feel to it, but it also has a wireless charging dock and the trigger stops don't get in your way either. And then if you want something with a bit more of a rubber membrane control to it, you've got the GameSir Supernova and the 8BitDo Ultimate 2, and both of these also have wireless charging docks too. So in general, if I had to pick between these four controllers, this one would come in fourth place, but it's still not a half bad controller for the price point. So in the end, Anbernic is releasing a controller in a very crowded space at a very crowded price point, and there are other companies who've been making controllers for a lot longer than them who have done it a little bit better. So I would recommend some of the alternatives unless you can find this one at a very good sale price. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.